I'd like to welcome you to our session today on Public Works COVID-19 strategies. We will look at impacts, innovations, and lessons learned through this current pandemic. My name is Stan Brown. I'm a member services consultant with the Georgia Municipal Association, and I thank you for joining us for this session. I know I had the opportunity to interview the four people that are on the video here today: Andrew Parker from Dalton, Chris Rotowski from City of Gainesville, Bobby Marr from City of St. Mary's, and Kevin Gentry, the Streets and Drainage Division Manager for Athens-Clarke County. And what we're going to do today is, based on the interviews we've had, I put together a presentation here that I'd like for us just to have a conversation about. And we're going to touch on some of the things that we talked about during our interviews. And then we'll specifically kind of hone in on public works planning and preparedness as we embarked on this COVID pandemic. Then we'll talk about the impact we've had on services. Then we'll discuss some of the challenges, lessons learned, and innovations that we've learned along the way. And we'll look at that both from a national perspective and also here in Georgia, based on what you guys have experienced. And then we'll try to wrap up with some keys to success and then a few takeaways. With that said, looking at planning and preparation, I know I was able to see some of the work that was done by Andrew Parker from Dalton and Chris Rotowski from Gainesville, where they put together, I think Gainesville called it an emergency response plan, and of course Dalton put together what they called protocols, public works protocols, which identified their priority of services. And Chris, if you would just share with us a little bit about how you guys put together the emergency response plan, sort of the background on that, and how you guys kind of took the lead there within Gainesville of leaning forward on this.
Sure. I appreciate you asking me to be a part of this panel, Stan. This is obviously a situation that none of us has faced before. I certainly am not familiar with pandemic and pandemic planning. And so with that, trying to first get a grasp on what the situation was and is, and as it is ever changing, and then two, starting to plan for how my department will manage that. And so I dropped back to the things that I knew, basically going off muscle memory. And I went back to my standard emergency response plan. Of course, that is normally for weather events or other type of kind of physical events that we then manage and work our way through. But I use that as the framework to then go through and plan out for each of the 8 divisions within the Gainesville Public Works Department of what each of those divisions would do and what resources they would need, and then how to manage the personnel and the resources for each of those divisions. And so we went through, prioritized what our work responsibility is for each of those divisions, and then basically went from there to develop a plan of how to address this and how to move forward through this pandemic experience.
Okay. And I think you mentioned when we were interviewing that you've done this before on other events that weren't a pandemic, but more of a all hazard situation. Whether it be an ice storm or tornado or thunderstorm or whatever the event is, you guys have a history of having an emergency response plan. So you had a template to start with.
That's correct. And that's what I went off of because, they usually are, ice storms are very common for us, even large regular thunderstorms or potential tornadoes, straight line winds, even hurricanes. The last year with the hurricanes that came blowing through the southeast, and each one of those, we've modified our template slightly for the event that we are within. And so I really treated this not much differently. It just took a lot of different changes and tweaking to each portion of that plan. But I went back to my same template to work off of to really start developing what we would do. And of course, typically in a physical event like that, we have what we call our streets division is really our primary division that is focused mostly on cleaning up debris. Well, with this, our primary division ended up becoming our solid waste division because of the nature of this and the nature of people being sheltering in place at home and with kids being out of school, and our solid waste, just the volumes ratcheted up exponentially. And of course, keeping things clean and tidy is one of the primary things we need to do to try to prevent this virus from spreading. So that was really a change in the overall plan, but the template was still used in the same fashion. And it just became our solid waste group became the primary.
Right. And as we discussed and looked at, by you having a plan like that, it was a great way for you in working with your management there, with the city manager and the council to really help manage the perception of what was going on, your expectations, and the performance that you were going to be able to provide. And I think that is key, to have that good communication out there. And looks like you were successful in doing that.
Yeah, of course, there's always hiccups, but as a general rule, I've been very pleased with it. And it does. You're right. The communication portion is huge. And the plan does allow us to communicate much more effectively.
Right. Let's switch over to Dalton. Andrew, you were able to put together, I know you conversed with Chris a little bit about what he was doing. I think y'all were working together. And I think that's the beauty of having a good professional network, is to learn from each other and to do some discussion about that and figure out best practices to use. But you came up with what you called service protocols. You want to kind of walk us through how that evolved and how you put those in place and how that's worked?
Yes, thank you, Stan. As Chris said, about 6 or 7 weeks ago, when we were pretty confident that there would be a pandemic threat, our elected officials called the department heads together across city operations, and they asked us to identify pretty quickly a contingency plan that we could convey to our residents as well as the community about how we would approach a pandemic, which, as Chris said, is totally uncharted territory for most of us, because not only do you have to worry about continuity of service and operations, but also maintaining the health and welfare of our staff. And so rather than make it overcomplicated, I basically put together what I called service protocols that we could communicate very easily with the elected officials, which basically divided our normal services into 3 primary categories. The first of which you see on the screen is critical services. So these were the items that we do on a daily basis that we considered critical and that we would attempt to provide at all times, no matter if we started having potential cases here at Public Works Department in Dalton. We wanted to continue to be able to prioritize these items, which include things like household garbage collection, which, as you know, can ultimately become a hygiene and cleanliness issue if garbage starts to accumulate for residents. And we have a program here in Dalton for providing backdoor service for elderly and disabled residents. Of course, we don't want to put, they're already in a compromised position, so we don't want to put them at more risk by asking them to do something they're not already normally doing. Second of all, we operate a pretty large 100-acre public cemetery. So obviously during a pandemic, the need to maintain the cemetery doesn't stop. So we prioritize that and consider that a critical service, also to coordinate with our local funeral homes. Emergency road and bridge repair. Over the last 6 weeks, I can think in Dalton, we've had one pretty urgent bridge deck repair that had to take place that we weren't expecting, as well as a corrugated metal pipe on a 2-lane road that collapsed on a Saturday. And again, you think of these as plans, but ultimately it could come to fruition, and we've had to respond to these type issues. Stormwater pipe culvert, stormwater structure maintenance. Just 2 weeks ago, Dalton experienced a 100-year flood. We, in 10 years that I've been with the city of Dalton, we have not had a rain event of that magnitude. I think it was like 6.3 inches in 11 hours. And it just so happens that we're in a pandemic situation. So we were having to bring folks in that were on call to come in and respond to emergencies. And the maintenance of those critical structures is still key because you don't want flooding or other issues to start happening as a result of neglected maintenance. Of course, traffic signal operations, that's a critical piece. We have about 91 traffic signals that we're charged with maintaining in the city. So that has to continue because the safety of our corridors and everything is still very critical. Inclement weather response, as I mentioned, we had a pretty major storm here recently that we had to dispatch crews on, and then obviously removal of dead animals from the right-of-way, which it goes back to being a hygiene cleanliness issue. So those were the services that we classified as critical, which was basically a third of our operation. The second group we titled desired functions, but these were the services that we said may be temporarily halted during the pandemic. The first of which is curbside recycling. The city of Dalton provides, like many communities, curbside recycling, but unfortunately in Dalton we don't have a single stream automated process, so we actually have employees sorting recycling at the curb, and so that presented some pretty immediate concerns with employees, the uncertainty about surface-to-surface contact with this virus. The last thing we wanted to be doing was exposing our operators to this, but also potentially spreading it from household to household as the operators went from home to home, touching bins and items like water bottles, aluminum cans, things of that nature. So unfortunately, we have had to suspend that for about a month now. We also in the city provide brush and refuse collection. So far, we have not had to halt that. This goes along with like bulky item pickup like white goods and those type items. We have been able to continue to provide that service. Street sweeping, again, we have scaled that down slightly during the pandemic to allocate more resources to garbage collection. Going back to curbside recycling, since we had to halt that temporarily, we wanted to provide additional garbage collection opportunities for the residents. And so that's required extra resources to be dedicated to garbage collection. Roadside litter pickup, we have a pretty advanced community service program with the city. And the main thing that those folks do for us is help pick up litter along the right-of-way, as well as mow and weed eat. And unfortunately, we had to halt that community service operation, which means our litter pickup operations have scaled down. And we're starting to see, the impacts from that. We're having to dedicate crews to go out every once in a while and pick up litter so that it doesn't accumulate on the right-of-way. Sign installation and maintenance, obviously that can be somewhat halted if necessary, except for regulatory type signs like stop signs, speed limit signs. Mowing of right-of-way, again, it's not desired to be halted, but if absolutely necessary, the items in the last slide, the critical services, we deem those more important than what's shown here. And then at the city, we have Public Works Committee meetings, which we haven't had to halt. We've just had to move to the digital platform, something similar to what we're on today. So that was kind of the second subset. And then the final group, Stan, was the deferrable items. These are the items we identified pretty quickly that we could defer as needed because based on the way I put this together, calling it service protocols, what I had imagined is if we start to have employees who get sick or get put in a physician-ordered quarantine, there were probably items we'd have to start, or services that we may have to start turning off as necessary to reallocate resources to other divisions like our sanitation division, where we know we want to continue delivering those critical services. So this list include things like sidewalk repairs, street construction resurfacing projects, leaf collection, which fortunately we're not in the fall for that. Arborist services, we have a city arborist that can go out and meet with homeowners about hazardous trees or tree evaluations. Traffic studies, we have a lot of requests for that we've had to kind of put on hold temporarily. Landscaping projects, and of course special events, which again in the pandemic there's not been a tremendous amount of special events, so that has not been that big of an issue. And then curb cut permits for new residential and commercial development. Those are the items that we said if we start to have to turn off certain services, these are the ones we can go without for a month or two until we can reallocate resources back to them. So that's sort of the approach we took, Stan.
Okay, and I think as we discussed, the department heads there with City of Dalton basically got together and looked at this overall, not just Public Works, but all the other services as well, to make sure that there was a good game plan of how you would implement services during COVID. And I think that's served you well as a staff in terms of dealing with the council and with the public. And we'll talk a little bit later about some of the communication efforts y'all have made and the impact of that. So, all right. Chris, if you would, just give us a little bit of a rundown of how you handled the staffing during this period and how that's been working for you.
Be happy to do that. As I mentioned a minute ago, we identified our solid waste division as the most critical function for our city regarding how Public Works responded to the pandemic. So with that, knowing that our volumes were increasing and knowing that solid waste is one of those things that is very much driven by routes and schedules and that type of thing. From a staffing perspective, we chose to maintain our full staff for our solid waste department with a couple of exceptions of rotating our division manager and assistant division manager each week so that we would hopefully have one healthy manager in place each week. That's worked out pretty well for us. We've been able to do that. And through that, we've been able to maintain consistency for our solid waste staff. Our streets division is our next largest division based upon number of personnel. And so with that, knowing that they would most likely be the group that would backfill the most within solid waste, we chose to split that division into two groups to alternate from 1 week to the next. And so we have 1 week of active employment for half of that staff. And so they are here doing the standard things that they normally would do. And then the other half is in what we call a reserve status. And that reserve status is really to be in the healthy condition and trying to maintain that workforce. Of course, you know, when Andrew mentioned the storm that they had, we fortunately didn't quite have quite as severe a storm, I don't believe, as they did, but we still had a lot of trees down and that type of thing. So we had to bring in a few more of our staff, but we were still able to maintain that rolling schedule by splitting that division, and that's helped us out. Fortunately, our solid waste staff has been healthy, and we've not really had to backfill that many positions. But of course, we're not through this yet, and with that, we're still trying to work at maintaining that schedule so that we'll always have a workforce to be able to handle that solid waste side. Some of our other divisions, it's interesting. We also have a cemetery here in Gainesville, and so we did a similar thing with our cemetery staff. We divided it into two groups, and they alternate weekly. That way, we always have the manager and assistant manager available to schedule, coordinate burials, but also we have some maintenance going on within the cemetery because this time of year especially, everything is growing and blooming and developing. And so we still are trying to maintain those services and maintain a certain quality there as well. So we did that division into two groups for that division as well. Our vehicle services division, or a lot of people refer to it as a fleet maintenance division, we identified what the primary functions of that group would be, and that was to do emergency repairs for basically first responder groups, police, fire, and public works being the primary of those. And so we divided that staff as well so that we had at least two mechanics and a manager in place to handle those emergency repairs as needed, and also to be able to still maintain some of our standard operations and standard repairs. Our traffic division, we also divided into 2 alternating groups. Of course, with storms, we've had a lot of signals that have been gone into flash or for whatever reason been damaged, and we've had to bring those in emergency response. But we've still been able to maintain functions of the city and maintain functions of the traffic division by doing that and dividing the staff into 2 alternating groups. So overall, it's really been a situation that's helped tremendously. Our PLMB are what we call public lands and buildings, and a lot of people call building maintenance division. We've done the alternating groups as well. Our engineering and administration division, we've handled a little bit differently in that myself as the director, and I have 2 deputy directors, and we've rotated. So typically at least 2 of those individuals are in the office around town or working in some full capacity, and 1 is rotating to maintain that we have a healthy manager in place. Much of the staff that's doing other things, we've been able to work out so that they could telecommute. We're taking this opportunity to do a lot of things like scanning in old road files and scanning in old documents so that people that typically are in an office environment, they can still work from home and be productive for our department and productive for the city as a whole. And so we've been able to utilize really some creativity there. We've also rolled our city phone, our main city public works line, to a cell phone so that we're still answering calls from the public. Even though our offices and our buildings are closed, we're still functioning as a city public works department and helping our citizens. And then some of the other staff we've alternated into groups as well, or put into the alternating groups to make sure that we maintain a healthy workforce. And then finally, we have an airport division, and we only have 1 person in that division, and that's the airport manager, and she's predominantly working from home, reports as needed, but of course there's still lease issues to deal with and maintenance issues to deal with and all of those things. And so we've been creative in how we've handled things with our staff. We worked really hard to make sure that there was something that everyone could do, even if they're teleworking from home, with things like what I mentioned, the scanning in of documents and maintaining those type things. But our primary goal in all of this was to be able to still maintain a certain level of work being accomplished, and to maintain a healthy workforce so that we could complete the tasks of the Public Works Department for the city and keep those things moving forward.
Right. All right. Kevin, share with us a little bit of the Athens experience, how you started off in the pandemic, and then how things are going today.
Well, I guess we're a little different than other public works that are with us here today, because our public utilities is their own department, solid waste has their own department, and certainly central services that does our mowing and litter pickup, they have their own department, and that includes fleet is in with them. But as far as what we do, we have traffic engineering, of course, streets and drainage, and then we have our engineering division. So it was very confusing at first because there were so many decisions that had to be made and changed based on what was coming from the federal government and the state government. But Athens, I think, was one of the first ones to do the shelter in place. And so that was early on, like I think around the 18th or 19th of March. And so they did the shelter in place. As far as employees, we were staggering our shifts. We had half our people here one week and half the next week, staggering our shifts. And we were trying to maintain some operations, not just handling emergencies, but handling our operations. Certainly a lot of the other departments I mentioned had to have staff here to treatment plants, and they had to have a lot of other solid waste. I don't think they missed a beat. They got the single, the auto loader trucks or self loaders, whatever. So they had one driver, so they were fine. Leaf and limb, they kept that up. They are behind. The landfill, they had some issues, I think, but they had to close it and reopen it. But as far as our work, we're kind of like some of the other guys. We've got some projects that are really in dire need. We've got a road that washed out and been washed out since February 19th. So we're still trying to get it back. We've got another major road that's closed, an industrial area, and we've got to get it back. So we have been able to allow the contractors to work on that. I've got this past Monday, I've got all of our staff back in my division. There's 40 positions, so we're all back in working now. But what we are doing is we're having one person per vehicle or equipment. They are certainly keeping their social distance 6 feet apart. They're bringing their lunch and not going separating, not congregating, wiping down their trucks inside and out before and after each shift, and their tools and things like that. So we've changed a lot of how it's had to change a lot of how we do things. Our backlog of work orders has tripled. We've never had this many work orders. What we got. Certainly, our commissioner requests have gone uncompleted, which it's not popular, but that's what happens. We have to prioritize our work. And we're fortunate. We've only had a few trees. Those storms that Andrew and Chris have talked about missed us and went north, so we were thankful for that.
Yeah.
But, I mean, we're operating as normal right now as we can with these social distancing and
Right.
operations. So
Right.
I would like to mention about our engineering staff and our traffic engineering. Now they've been working right on too. They've been fully staffed. But as far as the telecommuting or teleworking, whatever you want to call it, we've got VPNs, we've got phones. My secretary, she's working from home, doing well. I did that some at the very beginning. So I did that, and then our engineering staff is working from home, and they're driving their county vehicles home. So if they're coming right in, going to the job, not going to the office. If they have inspections, they're doing inspections. Otherwise, we're working from home, reviewing contracts or whatever they have to do.
Okay. So really a very good use of technology and being innovative and flexible. That's what I've been hearing you respond with is from the very beginning, there's a big pullback of, trying to keep people sheltered in place. Athens kind of being a lead in that, but you've been able to transition back into a little bit more routine work, but at the same time, the social distancing and looking after people and trying to keep them healthy.
Yeah, I would like to mention that our offices have been closed for, I guess, over a month now. All county offices are closed to the public. They have made some concessions, like in planning. I think twice a week they're letting people drop plans off, and building inspections is respecting. But yes, my office is closed. All offices are closed to the public right now.
Okay. All right. Very good. Thanks, Kevin. And so looking at another part of this, and really I'll talk primarily with Bobby Marr on this, but I know there's been some effort by the city of Gainesville to offer assistance to some of the smaller cities with their water and wastewater operations. I don't think any of the cities have had to really take advantage of that, but again, it just shows that we all work together when we get into a situation like this. Staff works very well across city lines, and so that's been encouraging. Bobby, talk a little bit about what you've been dealing with, whereas they've had a lot more emphasis on solid waste. You've got that contracted out, and you've got your plant operations contracted out, but you still have a lot going on with water and water costs.
Right. I'll start off first on the solid waste side. We've been contracted out with a local hauler for about 12 years now. However, they did get hit with the virus issues just like everyone else. So I had to put a few grapple trucks back out to assist with yard waste operations, but I've since pulled them back in, so it's all on the contractor again. So I did have to take on some of that role again, very short period. And the wastewater side, for about 2 years now, I've been contracted out with a privatized company to handle plant operations. We still handle the collection system, and we handle the water distribution system as well as water plants up until a couple weeks ago when I lost my lead water plant operator. So I rolled that into that same contract for wastewater operations. So now all my plants are handled by the same private contractor. I also, due to the pandemic, reached out to a secondary contractor in case my current one gets hit with the virus. I have a backup that can roll right in. They're familiar with my plants already, so it'll just be a matter of a phone call, and I can have more operators in to handle. As far as the distribution and collection side of the water and sewer systems, we're pretty well jumping, from emergency to emergency, from breaks to backed up sewer lines to sinkholes forming. So that's taking up most of our days, instead of being able to handle the normal routine stuff. With everyone being at home, it seems like not only garbage, but our water and sewer systems are getting hit tremendously as well.
Yeah. Bobby, one of the preparations that you've done over the years, though, is a lot of cross-training you've done between your street crews and your utility crews. Has that come into play really well for you?
It has. I've actually had some guys that normally are on zero-turn mowers in the whole fix and broke water lines.
Okay.
Because I have, put that into play for many years now to get them out of their comfort zones and the day-to-day, just for reasons. What I had in mind was hurricanes, not a pandemic, but it's serving us well.
Right. Okay. And another resource for our communities out there to be aware of is Georgia Rural Water. We at GMA reached out to them early on to find their capability, and they've assured us that they have resources they can call upon to help small cities that, there's that concern that if you have one person that comes up positive, then you have others that have been affected by it and exposed to it. Then what do you do with your water and sewer operations? So that's another tool to have in the box there, is to be able to reach back to Georgia Rural Water. But again, like with St. Mary's, with the cross training that they've had, having backup contractors in addition to the regular contractors operating plants, and with the largest city of Gainesville helping out Lula and Fly Branch, the two smaller systems with water and wastewater plant operations. It's good to see people having that backup plan of what if, to where we realize those are critical services, as health and welfare, just like solid waste. So good examples there, and the work that you're doing, Bobby. And I know you mentioned to me that you guys have the hurricane down pat, but this was a little bit different. And but hopefully that experience y'all had in the hurricanes have helped you to adapt and to be flexible. And so you're doing a great job there. We talked a lot about how we're trying to separate employees with split work schedules and social distancing. Just through the interviews, these were some of the things that came about in our discussion: the daily pre-work health screenings, use of PPE, the mask and gloves, and the critical aspect of that, social distancing. Heard several mention there of disinfecting vehicles, tools, and equipment. The idea from Athens of having one person per vehicle that worked especially well when you had to split crews. I'm sure now that they've got everybody back on board, they have to be more conscious of that to keep that social distancing going. Teleworking to the extent possible. All these are ways that we're trying to keep operations going, but be sensitive to our employees and look after their safety and their well-being. And looks like those are some good examples of how you guys have been doing that. When we started looking at the impacts of public works operations, kind of looked at it in terms of the major services that are being provided, and what we found in our discussions is that solid waste has kind of become sort of the priority service here, looking at it from a health and welfare. I know St. Mary's, Bobby and his crew, they do it with contract operations. The other communities we talk with are doing it in-house. nonetheless, it's important to keep the debris off the roads. We're seeing that you almost have that perfect storm where you've got spring cleaning taking place. Everyone's at home with the shelter in place, so there's a lot of trash being generated, and so that's been a big emphasis to try to keep the communities healthy and safe. I know Gainesville mentioned that they had a 50% increase over the previous year when it comes to trash volumes out there, and particularly yard waste. Curbside recycling, we discussed that. And Andrew, I think you mentioned you're looking at being able to get that back operating again. Is that correct on the curbside recycling? I know you had to discontinue it at the onset.
That's correct, Stan. We made the announcement this afternoon to the local public that we were resuming that program on Monday. Of course, we're going to take precautions with the employees about PPE, as we've discussed, to make sure they can do it in a very safe fashion. But it's very well received by the public, and it's reminded everyone how important this program is to our residents. They've really missed, because now we're about a month into not providing the service. So everybody's excited to get that started back on Monday.
Yeah. And I'm sure there'll be a demand increase there as well from that. Cemeteries, what we have found in our discussions is that actually was sort of a minimal impact as far as being able to provide that service. Initially, there was some concern about large crowds assembling for graveside services, but once the pandemic kind of evolved and the guidelines were issued, that has backed off. The funeral homes have been good to work with on that. And in that regard, I think the threat was probably greater than reality, as a lot of these services will be held after people can start gathering again, is what we're hearing. Water and wastewater, again, the big impact there is to pre-plan and to have a backup plan, and that gives a lot of peace of mind. I know with St. Mary's, it's great to have private operations, but it's good to have a backup private contractor that can step in as needed. And of course, the cross-training of staff has been very effective there. When it comes to streets, the emergency items are getting taken care of. As Kevin mentioned, the work orders are building up as far as the more routine work and the recurring work. The idea as this moves forward, we'll have to get, to a point of trying to pick back up on some of that, as Andrew has mentioned about putting litter crews out to make up the difference. I know a lot of our communities depend heavily on community service workers and inmate labor, and when that's not available, that definitely has an impact. Stormwater, of course, it varies by city, but having some flooding events and having the storms that came through, it's like a double whammy we're getting as far as emergency response. And but overall, the impact on emergency response has been minimal because we step up and do what we have to do. But clearly, there'll be some deferred maintenance and cleaning of storm drains and stuff that probably is being deferred now that we'll pick up later. Fleet maintenance, the impact there on the emergency response vehicles has been minimal. Again, some of the non-emergency work will be deferred, and that'll have a carryover impact. Facilities and grounds, again, same as with fleet operations. Emergency responses have been effective. There will be deferred maintenance to pick up. So I guess the story here is that although Public Works is holding its own and providing those critical services, the more routine items will be backlogged, and there'll be a bit of a price to pay later on trying to catch up on those. Talk a little bit about some of the challenges, lessons learned, and innovations that have occurred. And first, I want to talk about national. And what I've done here is really summarize some of the points that have come out of several forums that American Public Works Association have put on for public works leaders and professionals across the country. From an emergency management standpoint, the idea there that really resonated was to keep the long term in mind. What should be anticipated as this crisis ends. I mean, it's one thing to be in the storm, but we need to be thinking about what happens as as businesses start to open back up and communities open up, and what carries forward as far as the guidelines, and how do we continue to meet expectations and meet the emergencies that are out there. Actions and preventive measures for COVID have benefits beyond just pandemics when it comes to all hazards. I think being flexible and being able to adjust and take our emergency operations plan, much as Chris did in Gainesville, and adapt it to this situation is critical to success. Keeping those relationships going, whether networking with other cities or within the community with our local and federal partners, very important. And have someone taking notes now, because we're learning lessons as we go that it may not be that it's COVID in the future, but we may have similar crises to deal with and other pandemics. So definitely want to learn from this experience to where we get a jump start when we have to respond again. On the solid waste side, those guys work in solid waste. Most of those did not have the alternating weeks. They worked full time the whole time. And so morale and safety has been critical there. Sanitizing trucks, limiting staff in small areas, alternating shifts are all good ideas to try to minimize your impact with a case or an exposure taking place. Some of the options, including changing operations such as postponing yard waste collections, closing a landfill to residential customers. Those are the things we're seeing nationwide that are happening. Being flexible, but yet staying within the guidelines, very important. And then some of the challenges that have been faced with, leave, and particularly the emergency sick leave, and how we deal with FMLA and some of the laws that were implemented on an emergency basis have been challenging for some operations, particularly when it comes to taking care of family members that may have symptoms. From a leadership and management standpoint, again, the alternating work and doing work remotely have been sort of the trends we're seeing throughout the country, taking the staff temperatures on shifts to make sure that we can send people home if they are showing signs of any illnesses. But it's important to keep morale high. Leaders have to take the front on that and not isolate themselves. There's a tendency when you go into telecommuting and working remotely that you can become disengaged, and that would not be a good thing for leaders. You want to make sure that you're there, you can communicate with your staff, make sure they know that you're taking care of them. And of course, we know from a leadership and management standpoint, there will be some lasting impact from this when it comes to revenues that are being lost and potential budget cuts that we're liable to face. I think that's probably inevitable, and I know we at GMA are putting on a webinar later this month on financial forecasting and budget forecasting and how do we deal with this. It's kind of a reminder of what we all dealt with back in the recession, that it's going to become tight financially for us all. Fleet, again, extra cleaning of shop and equipment, limiting outside exposures by prohibiting any non-fleet personnel in the shop. Having deliveries dropped outside the building is preferred instead of having the interaction with deliveries. But they've also experienced some challenges in getting parts for repairs. And I think we've also heard, as we've discussed with these interviews, that sometimes we're having challenges getting PPE and sanitizing supplies and that sort of thing. Here in Georgia, and I tried to summarize what we had talked about, and I'll just hit them real quick, but there were a lot of points of confusion at the beginning as rules were changing and guidelines were changing. I think we saw that in Athens. We saw it in St. Mary's. It's kind of a new situation. It's not a hurricane. It's not a tornado. It's not a flood. It's a whole different type of hazard that we're dealing with. I think I heard in Athens that it's tough when you've got 40 some odd employees and they don't have city email accounts. Just being able to reach out and communicate with your staff can be a challenge. So that's something that's been a difficult thing. I don't think we ever anticipated the challenges of acquiring the PPE and the sanitary wipes, and we've seen that some were innovative and have created their own. Emergency sick leave and FMLA that we mentioned earlier, the loss of the community service workers and inmates and the impact that that's had on operations. The catch-up that will be out there for sure on deferred, routine, recurring work. FEMA reimbursement. We haven't talked much about that, but we realize that when you look at the eligibility requirements, a lot of this, we may not see a lot of money coming from this. Just depends on how the interpretation is as far as increased operations and eligible overtime. It's not like a storm event where you've got debris that you're removing and contract operations and a lot of equipment being used. Here you're looking at primarily your purchases of PPE and sanitary wipes and maybe some staffing that you can justify. Economic impact, we know will impact our funding and our staffing beyond this crisis as budgets are going to get very tight. A lot is being done to try to get some help from the federal government as far as some of the losses that local governments are experiencing. We're seeing that small businesses and economic development is seeing some relief come forth. The larger communities are getting also some assistance through the COVID relief funds that are out there. We're still working on that at the local level, the smaller communities. As I heard Bobby say, we've been through a lot of disasters, including hurricanes, but wasn't quite prepared for this one. And but I think with the experience that we've had, that probably is a statement that's not true anymore. I think we probably are prepared and are doing a great job. And of course, sometimes it's hard to see what the end state will be like. Lessons learned, planning and preparedness provides clarity for operations. Teleworking and the use of technology has been very impactful in this event, the pandemic going on. We've seen the use of take-home vehicles working well for some, communicating, messaging, both internally and externally, within the staff, but also with the public and with the media. Paying attention to what's going on outside of your box, what's happening in your community, what's happening with other departments, what's happening at the state level, what is the governor saying, what are the guidance that we're hearing from the feds, from CDC, all that is important. Flexibility to adapt. Having templates in place is a great help, but we've got to be agile and flexible to make sure we adapt to whatever we're facing. And again, that outside the box thinking. Having a stockpile of PPE and cleaning supplies. Having sources and resources of where to get those things. And then Andrew was mentioning the single stream recycling. That's something that can avoid that issue of having to do the manual sort if we can get to that in all of our communities. I think one of the more important things that's been learned through this is that I think the communities are more aware of the critical services that Public Works does provide. Police and fire, I think everybody sees them as being first responders, but without a doubt, Public Works is in that category. I know at the federal level that's being recognized. Some of our governors throughout the country are seeing that as well when they issue their executive orders and they talk about different benefits for first responders. They're now including Public Works in that conversation. So that's one of the pluses we're seeing from this. Some of the innovations. Kevin, what about the downtown? How has that worked out for you?
Yeah, that worked out really well. We've been they're doing a streetscape project on Clayton Street, downtown Athens, and that has probably the most businesses on it, and it's been really impacted them. So since the businesses have been closed, there are a few restaurants down there that do the curbside service, but we've taken advantage of that. And when we were working half crews, we had all three of our crews down there working. They weren't working in the same location. They were all three were in three different locations, but we've been able to knock that job out. We're going to finish it next week, and time for the contractor to come in there and get started. It's been very beneficial for us to do that.
Yeah, and Chris, I think you've seen some of the same there in Gainesville, haven't you?
Absolutely, Stan. It's interesting how when you really pay attention and folks are staying at home and limited in where they're going and work is limited, what opportunities are there for you? And so we've been able to utilize some of those opportunities for things like signal work. We've also even been able to do some significant paving on roadways that have large volumes typically, but given that the timing of this and with school being out now and other businesses either reduced or not in function right now, we were then able to capitalize on that and get a lot of the paving and patching type work done that normally would have taken much longer and required much more coordination to make it happen. So If there is a silver lining to a lot of this, there are opportunities there if you pay attention and can utilize and take advantage of those opportunities.
Okay, great. And Bobby, if you would share with us about the joint city-county employee clinic and how that's been a benefit to you guys through this effort.
Yes, this is a joint effort with the cities, the 3 cities in the county together, along with our local recreation authority. It's a joint health clinic that we utilize on just a normal day-to-day prior to the pandemic as well. That's free to all our employees. So it speeds up a lot of the process, but during the pandemic, we also made it available to those such as our part-time employees that it hadn't been available to before. But we can get a lot of the pre-screening, a lot of the symptoms checked out to see if it needed any further, checking up, or testing. But it's been a real boon being able to just speed that process up instead of having to try to get to a regular health clinic or emergency room to get these checked out.
Right. And I think you also mentioned a good working relationship with your fire chief on doing some of the pre-work screenings for you.
Oh, yeah. Every morning he shows up at all our departments and checks temperature so that before they even come into work, having the temperature checks so we know right away who to send home or not. So far, we haven't had to send anyone home, but it is just a preliminary check.
All right. And then tell us a little bit, Bobby, about some of your non-essential employees and how they also stepped up to the challenge.
Our libraries, aquatic centers, senior center, those type functions that are shut down during the pandemic, those employees we've utilized in a meal delivery process for our elderly or high, or what's the word, the population that's more apt to get the virus. So every day we deliver those, at least one hot meal to those candidates. And right now we're up to just over 80 a day.
Wow. Okay.
To the mostly elderly population in the same areas.
All right. And I think you've mentioned y'all have had employees making their own mask, and either yours or Athens one was doing their own bleach wipes. Where you couldn't get the sanitation wipes, taking Clorox and other materials and basically doing your own.
Yeah, Stan, what we've done that too, and making the masks. Speaking of that, they've got a lot of people that are out making masks now. Our Linden House has 5 workstations, and they're making masks out of T-shirts and things. And then I want to mention one more thing while you're on that subject is that one of our they're having something. They're taking the N95 masks from the hospitals over to the University of Georgia Veterinarian Hospital, and they're sanitizing them, and then they're taking them back. Well, they needed somebody to do the transport, and they called on Public Works, so I've got someone doing that.
Right. So I think across the board, we've seen Public Works really stepping up to the challenge and helping in a lot of non-traditional ways, and that's been exciting. Andrew, tell us about and how that's been effective there in Dalton.
So it's very similar to what Chris and Kevin talked about with their split work schedules. It's really an innovative approach to be able to manage risk is really what you're doing by being able to sort of keep a bullpen of employees in a ready-to-work position. And that, from an HR perspective, put us in a position to be able to pay these folks like normal, which I think is the case in some other jurisdictions as well. And the employees are advised or told that they need to be it's ready to work. So they need to be ready to come in at a moment's notice is what we call it. If we have a storm or if we have someone get sick and we need to replace that person, it's worked very well for us. And it's something I hope gives us a kind of an innovation or a lesson learned for if this ever comes up again. I think it was a very good approach. and that I was able to really take from my conversation with Chris Rutowski and another public works director in the city of Rome. That was an idea that they shared with us, and it goes back to your point of networking before an event like this, to be able to have those contacts, to be able to share ideas and innovations even before you really reach the peak of the pandemic.
Right. Okay. And then you guys have also done a good job with social media and communicating with the public. Got a couple of little clips here that you guys put out, shelter in place. The city of Dalton is working for you, showing your street crews doing work on a flood relief project.
That's correct. Yeah, we thought it was an excellent opportunity as a city and working with our communication staff to get the message out that we're still here working for our residents. We're still providing these critical services. What a great opportunity to be able to convey that message. And this was just a real simple tool. Our communications director put these together, and literally as director and supervisors, we just went out, took a picture of the daily work activities, and it's a great opportunity to share it with the public and remind them that even on days like today, Public Works is out delivering these critical services. So we've got a lot of good feedback from that as well.
Right. I think you shared with me that making good use of the website and also Facebook and other social media to get this word out to the community. There's a video that you've got out on Facebook that if you get an opportunity, check that out on City of Dalton. But it basically shows some of those operations going on in a video format. And to kind of wrap us up here, some of the keys to success and takeaways that we've learned through this process and listening to what's going on in the different cities here in Georgia with Public Works, that planning and preparation has been critical to success. Establishing and communicating priorities. We've seen that across the board. When the expectations are understood and accepted, then you have a good contract with your community as to what you can and can't do during this period of time. And there seems to be understanding. Everyone knows that we're all in this for the success and the health of all of our citizens. Taking care of staff has been a key thing for success. The social distancing, the work schedules to be able to split folks out so we don't have as much exposure, use of PPE, and mainly just communicating that you do indeed care for your staff and look after them. Those clear expectations and communications, both internally with the public, have been important. Networking among other public agencies. I heard that on a recurring point as we were interviewing the public works agencies here in Georgia, that those partnerships and those networks that are out there, they come into play during times like this. And lastly, that flexibility that we have to have in an ever-changing environment. I think we can see this as becoming a new normal. I don't think we're going back to where we were. Some of these things will definitely carry forward that we're experiencing here during the pandemic. And so we'll have to retain that flexibility as we move forward. There are a lot of good resources that are out there. I know with APWA, there's a COVID page that's out there that has all kind of links to other agencies, other associations, every topic you can imagine related to public works. Also with GMA, we've got a COVID coronavirus page that's out there that tries to pull all those resources from FEMA to the National League of Cities, what we're hearing from the CDC, from the state. I mean, it's a one-stop shop to go to and get everything you need to know about COVID and how to respond, how to try to address issues in your community. So that's good information. I do thank you all for taking the time today to be on the call, and would like to just give you all an opportunity to have some final thoughts. And I'll put Chris Rutowski on the spot first, but the rest of you, I'll call upon you as we go down the line. Chris, any final thoughts about this whole issue with Public Works and the response for the coronavirus?
Stan, I appreciate the opportunity, and it is a situation where you have to be ever flexible and really paying attention and thinking outside the box, trying to anticipate what's going to change next. as this pandemic develops, because there's so much that we still don't know. But we do know what our tasks are usually as public works. And so sometimes we just have to get creative in how we address those. But really what I would like to say is I can speak for my staff that they are a fantastic group of people. And I think public works employees in general are just fantastic people. They step up to whatever the challenge is. We've never had a pandemic challenge before, but I can tell you my public works staff has stepped up and absolutely met this challenge head on. And so I'm so very thankful for the people in public works. And it's an amazing group of folks that rarely ask for anything. Most of the time tries to avoid the limelight, but really just gets the job done each and every day. And so I'm most thankful for the employees that we have that are serving our citizens and just doing a fantastic job.
And thank you for the work that you're doing there with them. And it's good to see the success. Kevin, any final thoughts?
Yeah, just like Chris was saying, we've got a fantastic group of people that work tirelessly and unselfishly. They've come out whenever I needed them to. I've got people that didn't have to come in that came in anyway because they wanted to make sure the community's taken care of, and so they did a great job. I think the communication is key. I've kind of tried to relay everything as soon as I got it, and I mean that's what some of the confusion came in, because as quickly as things were changing by the federal government, state government, we were having to change with it, and people adapted and did a great job. And I think we have a COOP plan, and I think we had to brush that off and dust it off. So this last time we talked about a pandemic, I think was the bird flu pandemic way back when. So this is really unusual, but I appreciate all of our staff, and I know all of you guys here, and definitely the networking is great, and I appreciate the opportunity to come on here and talk.
Yeah, and when Kevin mentioned a COOP plan, that's it's not about chickens. It's a continuity of operations plan that Athens-Clarke County put together. And if you get an opportunity, go check out their website, and they've got a YouTube channel that they do community conversations between the manager and the mayor. And last night's event was strictly on the coronavirus and the response. And I think that's a great piece that we could all benefit from, of seeing how they're reaching out and trying to keep the community informed, because I think that's what we're seeing as one of our takeaways is this thing about communication. So thanks, Kevin, and for the work that you're doing there in Athens. Bobby, any final thoughts?
Yeah, I just want to add that the public works group in each city or municipality, county, whatever it is, they're all family. But more so in times like this, you start to figure out and see that statewide or nationally, that whole public works family is all one group.
Right.
We're identifying, we're dealing with all the same or very similar type challenges, and with that networking that comes through these trade shows or APWA, those kind of organizations is vital to having that ability to be able to pick up the phone and make that call to get some advice on something or see how someone else has handled the situation. So kudos to you, Stan, for putting this video together, and thank you everybody on the call. Very valuable going forward.
All right. Thank you, Bobby, and thank you for your leadership. Andrew, any final thoughts from you?
Well, I think these other gentlemen really recap very well. I think managing during a crisis has been a unique challenge for all of us. There's lessons learned. I appreciate you putting this tool together for folks to be able to look at. And as they said, it underscores how critical public works operations are. I think, as the gentleman mentioned, it has a tendency sometimes to not be recognized that way, but maintaining these functions through the pandemic, I think, have underscored how so many of the services provided by Public Works are so critical to the success of our community, the continuity of operations, and as the other gentleman said, it just makes you really thankful in a leadership position to have such dedicated employees who never complain. They never really seek recognition, and they've just continued to keep their head up and work through this as safely as possible. And as a director, it certainly makes me thankful for how first class these Public Works employees are across the spectrum.
Yeah, thank you, Andrew. I just want to thank all of you guys for participating in this process. I think there's a lot we learn from each other. The leadership you're providing in your communities is second to none, and I think we can all learn from the successes and also some of the lessons learned where we can get better in the future. But I do appreciate you coming on board for this. Hopefully this will be a resource that other cities can benefit from. And we know that this may be video 1.0. There may be more to come as this progresses. But great job so far, and thank you again.